And now we're going to have a look at one of the major things that impacts running performance. And this has got a lot to do with planning. Bonita, can you take us through the key phases of the training programs and help us understand what we should be doing and when?
With running programs, you've got to have a look at the year as a whole. And so if you're training for an event that's 12 weeks away, you've got to really think about what you were doing in the past 3 months before that event. So the base phase, that's what you've been doing over summer, even from like October last year, and just building that aerobic conditioning. So if you're looking at races in, say, July this year, you want to have been running a lot over our summer and even a bit earlier, just before the summer started. So that's sort of the base phase. And then I would say the build phase, like with the marathon, I would look at a build phase of about 12 weeks. So you really want to have a bit of a break. Like I always think you should have at least a week off or a week easy between these phases. And sometimes you could have like a race, you could do a half marathon. If you're training for a marathon, you could do a half marathon at the end of your base phase for a bit of a hit out, have a week easy, and then you start the marathon prep if that's what you're doing. And we look at that as the build phase. And in that phase, we're doing interval sessions, we're doing tempo runs, but within that phase, we're also doing specific efforts. So specific runs could be long runs that are at marathon pace. So they could be something like 3 to 4 times 5K. That's at marathon pace, a 2-minute jog or something like that. And that's sort of what you do maybe 5 weeks out or something. So you sort of build gradually to things like that. So if you're training for the marathon, you need to do a lot of running at marathon pace, but you don't need to run a marathon at your marathon pace. So you need to work that into your training. So when you get into the race, you're so comfortable with that pace that you know what it feels like and you know you can do it. But we don't want to train so hard that you get to the race and you're tired and you've trained too hard. I mean, I've made that mistake before as an athlete. I probably trained a bit too hard I trained for my first marathon actually, and I probably ran my marathon 5 weeks before the actual marathon. So I probably trained a bit too hard. I had a really good long run that I went a bit too hard in and I didn't quite recover before race day. So it can put you in a bit of a hole. Between 3 and 5 weeks out, you've got to be really careful that you don't put yourself into a hole. If you're feeling good and you want to run harder than what you should, don't do it. Save it for the race day. But I always think too, in a marathon prep, as part of specific prep in that build phase, look at doing a half marathon that's 3 to 5 weeks out where you're running some of it at marathon pace and then the last little bit slightly faster. So you're not going flat out, but you're practicing your gels, your drinks, you're in a race situation, you're running on the road, and you're sort of getting that pounding in your legs, practicing for what you're going to do in the near future. And most people I work with, they've always got some sort of a half marathon, or if you don't have a race, you could do a 20K effort in training as sort of a little bit of a hit out. So some people I coach don't like racing much and they still run really well in the marathon. So you've got to work with what you want to do and what makes you feel comfortable in your prep. And then we look at a taper phase in the marathon prep. And the taper phase probably begins about 3 weeks out, but very gradual. And I use a different taper for different people. So some people, quite an aggressive taper in the last week. So the last week before a marathon, it might only be 3 to 4 jogs of 30 minutes. And one of them might be a light session that's 10 minutes at marathon pace with a few 30-second strides afterwards. So that might be 3 to 5 days out from the marathon. And that's all I do that week. So a few rest days in there. Whereas other people like to not taper quite as much. But you've really got to look at 3 weeks before the race and looking at gradually decreasing volume and intensity. If you normally do a session that's 8 times a K on a Tuesday, in that taper phase, you might be doing 6 times a K. So you can still do the same sorts of sessions, but just decrease the intensity. And if you normally run 2 hours 20 on Sundays, you've got to go down to 1 hour 45, or the week before the race, I would only go 60 to 70 minutes. So you've got to really go down in volume as well. Really trying to increase your aerobic conditioning. Look, a base phase is just about running a lot, not being too focused. You want to be focused, but you can't be focused 12 months a year on your goal. So it's sort of just about building that mileage. So when you get to the build phase, you're comfortable with the mileage, you're able to handle it, but you haven't trained so hard that you're not ready to go when it really matters. So those 12 weeks before you race, that's when you've got to start really making sure that you're focused and doing all the right things with your recovery and nutrition and hydration and stuff like that, and rest. So the base phase, I think, is very important, and it's a bit overlooked because often in a base phase, we don't race much. We're just training. And I know when I was an athlete, the base phase for me when I was living in Europe was through winter, but for us, it's really through our summer here. And you've just got to get that hard training done week in, week out, but not be too focused on anything in particular. But then the build phase is really fun because once you get into that, that's when you're sort of dialing down on paces, looking at your goal race, and you might do a few lead-up races. It is really good to have some little lead-up races or hit-outs within your prep because we can't just train hard for 12 weeks. So you need to have weeks where you're not training quite as hard because you're doing a race. So you're not tapering for the race that you're doing within your prep. It's part of training, but you're decreasing the mileage a little bit. And that's really good to help your body recover from those really high mileage weeks. It is very important to not get stuck on, I've got to run X amount of mileage each week for X amount of weeks. That's not how running works. Like for anyone that I coach, if you're training for a half marathon and you do a 10K on a Sunday, then you'll do a long run on Tuesday. So don't always think that Tuesday's a session, because if you do a race on Sunday, you can't do an interval session on Tuesday. They're too close together. So you've got to really make sure that the training's structured around the intensity of what you're doing. And if you're in a marathon prep, it's even more important to not put too much intensity in there too close together, because that can make you really tired, especially if you're running fairly high mileage. And the taper phase, look, 2 to 3 weeks out, it's different for everyone. A lot of runners hate the taper phase because they just want to train hard and they hate taking rest days. They hate feeling like they're heavy. A lot of marathon runners say they feel heavy in the week before a marathon. But look, that's fine because you're carb loading and it's giving you that energy that you need when you get into your race. So you've got to really have that confidence to know that you're doing the right thing. Tapering is quite hard, but I generally think tapering, you're best off staying in the same sort of routine with the training that you're doing, but cutting the intensity and volume. So keep the similar running days, except for the last week before a marathon especially, because I would maybe take out a few runs, maybe have a few more rest days. But very low intensity that last week is really important.